The hum of the airplane cabin was steady, blending with the soft murmur of passengers settling into their seats. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary, just another flight carrying a mix of travelers excited about their destinations or resigned to their routines. But hidden in the ordinary was a moment no one could have predicted, a moment that would leave everyone on board stunned. Sophia, a single mother in her early 30s, had saved for months to take her 8-year-old son, Daniel, on this trip. For Daniel, this was more than just a vacation. It was his first time flying. His face glowed with curiosity as he leaned toward the window, his little hands clutching the armrest. "Mom, do the clouds feel soft like pillows?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. Sophia smiled, gently brushing a lock of his curly hair back. "Maybe one day you'll fly through them and find out," she replied. Her heart swelled with pride as she watched her son. This was supposed to be a memory they'd cherish, a simple yet magical journey. Nancy, the senior flight attendant, moved briskly down the aisle. Her uniform was immaculate, her posture commanding respect. For years, she had been a familiar face in the airline, known for her efficiency and discipline. But today, her sharp gaze scanned the cabin with an unusual intensity, her mood darker than the polished veneer she wore. As Nancy passed Sophia and Daniel's row, she noticed Daniel leaning slightly into the aisle, his eager eyes darting around the cabin. She stopped abruptly, her voice cutting through the ambient noise like a razor. "Young man, sit properly in your seat," she barked, her tone cold and firm. Daniel flinched, his small body jerking back into the seat. His wide eyes turned to his mother, brimming with confusion and embarrassment. Sophia placed a protective arm around him, her expression soft yet resolute. "I'm sorry," she said politely, her voice steady. "He's just excited. It's his first flight." But Nancy wasn't done. Her gaze hardened as she looked at Sophia, her voice rising enough to catch the attention of nearby passengers. "Excited or not, he needs to follow the rules. This isn't a playground." The air seemed to freeze around them. Passengers turned their heads, some whispering among themselves, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Daniel's face crumpled, and he whispered to his mother, "Did I do something wrong?" "No, sweetheart," Sophia said softly, her heart aching at his question. "You didn't do anything wrong." Unbeknownst to Nancy, her words and actions were being closely observed. In the first-class cabin, James Reed, a senior executive for the airline, had paused his work. He had heard the sharp tone and watched the interaction unfold. James was not one to intervene lightly, but something about the flight attendant's behavior unsettled him. He leaned back in his seat, his sharp mind already piecing together the implications of what he had seen. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted, an unspoken tension settling over the passengers. Sophia felt the weight of judgment and curiosity from those around her. She kept her arm firmly around Daniel, her resolve hardening as she silently vowed to protect him from further humiliation. Minutes passed, but the energy on the plane didn't return to normal. Nancy's movements grew sharper as she tended to her duties, her forced smiles and curt replies betraying her underlying frustration. Meanwhile, whispers spread among the passengers like wildfire, their glances bouncing between Sophia, Daniel, and the stern-faced flight attendant. James stood quietly and made his way to the galley, where Nancy was rearranging items on a tray. He cleared his throat, his voice calm yet commanding. "Excuse me, Miss Nancy," he said. "Could I have a word with you?" Nancy turned to face him, her demeanor shifting from authoritative to defensive. "Is there a problem, sir?" she asked, though her tone lacked the confidence she had displayed earlier. James' eyes were steady as he replied, "Yes, there is. Your behavior toward that family was unprofessional and unacceptable." Nancy's face reddened, her grip tightening on the tray she was holding. "I was only enforcing the rules," she replied curtly. "Safety is our priority." "I understand the importance of safety," James said evenly, "but there's a way to enforce rules without demeaning passengers. That boy was doing nothing disruptive. Your tone and words were entirely out of line." Nancy opened her mouth to protest but stopped short. Her face betrayed a flicker of doubt, perhaps even fear, as James's unwavering gaze bore into hers. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to ensure the conversation remained private. "I've reviewed incidents like this before, and I can tell when there's more to a situation than meets the eye. I suggest you think carefully about your actions." As James walked away, Nancy stood frozen in place, her mind racing. She hadn't expected to be called out, especially not in this way. For the first time, she began to feel the weight of her actions pressing down on her. Sophia noticed James' brief stop at their row, offering a small nod of reassurance. Though she didn't know who he was, his silent acknowledgement felt like a lifeline in a sea of judgment. The tension on the plane continued to simmer. Passengers whispered, exchanged knowing glances, and tried to decipher the unfolding drama. Nancy moved mechanically through her tasks, her confidence shaken. The air in the cabin felt heavy with unresolved tension, leaving everyone wondering what would happen next. No one could have imagined how the next 10 minutes would unfold or the shocking conclusion that awaited them all. The cabin settled into a tense silence as the plane climbed higher into the sky. Outside the windows, clouds stretched endlessly, their soft edges belying the heavy mood within. Passengers shifted uneasily in their seats, the earlier incident lingering like an unspoken question no one dared to ask aloud. Sophia tried to focus on calming Daniel, who had retreated into his drawing, his small hands gripping his pencil tightly as he shaded the wings of the airplane in his sketch. "Mom," Daniel said quietly, breaking the silence between them. "Why was she so mad at me?" Sophia swallowed hard, her fingers brushing against the back of his hand. "Sometimes people say things they shouldn't," she said gently, choosing her words carefully, "but it doesn't mean you did anything wrong. You were just being curious, and that's a good thing." Daniel's eyes searched her face, his expression a mix of innocence and uncertainty. "Do you think she doesn't like me?" he asked, his voice so soft it was almost a whisper. Sophia's heart twisted at the question. "No, sweetheart," she said firmly. "Some people just forget to be kind, but you don't need to worry about her, okay? You're amazing, just as you are." As Daniel nodded and returned to his drawing, Sophia glanced around the cabin. She could feel the eyes of other passengers flitting toward her and then quickly looking away. Some faces held sympathy. Others were harder to read. She straightened in her seat, determined not to let her discomfort show. This was supposed to be a special trip for Daniel, and she wasn't going to let one sour moment ruin it. In the galley, Nancy fumbled with the drink cart, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged cups and napkins. Her mind replayed the confrontation with James, his calm yet piercing words cutting through her usual sense of control. She hated the way her cheeks had flushed under his gaze, the way she had been rendered speechless. Rachel, the younger flight attendant with a friendly demeanor, stepped into the galley and noticed Nancy's strained expression. "Everything okay?" Rachel asked, her tone light but her eyes probing. "I'm fine," Nancy replied curtly, her voice sharper than intended. She'd avoided Rachel's gaze, focusing on the tray in front of her. Rachel hesitated, sensing the tension but unsure how to address it. Instead, she turned her attention to the rest of the cabin, her bright smile returning as she attended to the passengers. Unlike Nancy, Rachel had a natural warmth that made people feel at ease. She stopped briefly by Sophia and Daniel's row, crouching slightly to meet Daniel's eye level. "Hey there, buddy," Rachel said, her voice gentle. "What are you drawing?" Daniel looked up, holding up his sketch pad with a shy smile. "It's the plane," he said proudly. "I'm drawing it flying through the clouds." Rachel's smile widened. "That's amazing," she said. "You're really talented." Sophia watched the exchange with quiet gratitude, the kindness of this stranger easing some of the tension in her chest. It was a small moment, but it reminded her that not everyone on this flight saw her son as a problem. Meanwhile, in first class, James Reed sat back in his seat, his expression unreadable as he scrolled through messages on his phone. The report from his colleague was concise but damning. This wasn't the first time Nancy had been involved in a complaint. While her professionalism had once been an asset, recent incidents suggested a pattern of behavior that couldn't be ignored. James had spent years in the airline industry, and he prided himself on maintaining high standards for both safety and customer service. He understood the pressures of the job better than most, but he also believed in accountability. Nancy's actions weren't just a personal failing, they reflected poorly on the entire crew and the airline as a whole. As the flight continued, James's sharp eyes remained focused on the cabin. He noticed the subtle glances passengers exchanged, the way Nancy avoided eye contact as she moved through the aisles. Her confidence, once an unshakable part of her persona, seemed to be unraveling. Rachel passed by James' seat, her cheerful demeanor momentarily dimmed as she glanced toward the galley. James caught the flicker of concern in her expression, and he made a mental note to speak with her later. He wanted to understand how the rest of the crew perceived Nancy's behavior and whether there were deeper issues at play. In the economy cabin, the unease among the passengers persisted. Some had returned to their books or devices, but others whispered quietly, their curiosity about the unfolding situation growing. One man, seated a few rows behind Sophia, leaned toward his companion and muttered, "Did you see how she talked to that kid? Unbelievable." His companion nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I've flown a lot, but I've never seen anything like that. It's just wrong." Sophia overheard fragments of their conversation, but kept her gaze forward. She didn't want to add fuel to the fire, but she also couldn't ignore the subtle shift in the atmosphere. It was as though the passengers were silently taking sides, their unspoken judgments hanging in the air. Back in the galley, Nancy felt the weight of those unspoken judgments pressing down on her. She tried to shake it off, telling herself that she was simply enforcing the rules, that she hadn't done anything wrong. But James's words echoed in her mind, unsettling her in a way she couldn't fully articulate. She stole a glance at Sophia and Daniel, her jaw tightening as she saw them quietly interacting. For a brief moment, doubt crept into her thoughts. Had she overreacted? Was there something in her tone or approach that had crossed a line? The questions nagged at her, but she quickly pushed them aside, unwilling to confront the uncomfortable answers. As the plane cruised at 35,000 feet, the tension showed no signs of dissipating. James discreetly sent another message to his colleague, requesting a meeting upon landing to address the situation. He knew this wasn't just about one incident. It was about setting a precedent, one that reinforced the airline's commitment to treating every passenger with dignity and respect. The minutes ticked by, each one carrying the cabin closer to an inevitable confrontation. Passengers shifted in their seats, their curiosity and unease growing with every subtle glance and whispered exchange. Nancy, still performing her duties with mechanical precision, felt the walls closing in around her. And Sophia, though outwardly calm, clung tightly to her son's hand, silently bracing herself for whatever might come next. Everyone on that flight could feel it. Something was building, and no one knew how it would end. Nancy's footsteps echoed softly on the carpeted floor as she pushed the beverage cart down the aisle. Her movements were deliberate, almost robotic, as she avoided unnecessary interaction with the passengers. Every smile she forced, every polite "would you like something to drink," felt heavier than usual. She could feel the weight of their gazes, their unspoken judgments pressing against her like a tangible force. She told herself it didn't matter, she was just doing her job. But the memory of James Reed's calm yet pointed confrontation kept replaying in her mind, unsettling her more than she cared to admit. Sophia watched Nancy from the corner of her eye, her heart still heavy from earlier. She tried to focus on Daniel, who had switched from sketching to playing with a small puzzle he had packed in his bag. He was calm now, but she couldn't shake the memory of the confusion and sadness in his eyes after the flight attendant's harsh words. Sophia knew she had done her best to shield him from it, but she also knew the damage was done. Moments like that stayed with a child, whether they understood it fully or not. A few rows back, a young woman named Mia whispered to her husband, Adrian, "Did you notice how tense everyone's gotten? It's like nobody knows how to act now." Adrian nodded, glancing toward Nancy, who was speaking quietly with another passenger. "It's awkward," he replied. "I mean, what she did wasn't okay, but now it's like the whole plane is holding its breath." Mia frowned. "I just feel bad for that little boy. He looked so happy before, and now he's so quiet." Adrian looked at her, his face thoughtful. "Do you think we should say something?" "To the mom, maybe. Just to let her know people are on her side." Mia hesitated, unsure. "I don't know. Would that make it worse? She might not want the attention. Meanwhile, James Reed remained seated in first class, his mind working through the situation like a puzzle. He had already contacted his team on the ground, but he knew this couldn't wait until they landed. Nancy's behavior was more than a one-time misstep. It was part of a pattern that reflected poorly on the airline. He leaned back slightly, his gaze fixed on the back of Nancy's head as she moved down the aisle. Her posture was stiff, her movements too precise, as if she was trying to hold herself together. James's thoughts were interrupted by the quiet hum of Rachel's voice as she spoke with a passenger nearby. He observed her for a moment, noting the way she engaged with the passengers, her warmth and approachability a stark contrast to Nancy's demeanor. Rachel's interactions were effortless, her smile genuine, and James felt a glimmer of hope that not all was lost within the team. He decided he would speak with her soon, to understand the dynamics between the crew members and perhaps gain insight into the underlying issues. Nancy's tension was palpable as she reached the end of the aisle and turned the cart around. She glanced at Sophia and Daniel as she passed their row, her eyes flickering briefly toward the boys' puzzle before darting away. Sophia noticed the glance but said nothing, her own expression guarded. She wasn't interested in another confrontation, but she also wasn't going to let Nancy intimidate her. Back in the galley, Rachel found a moment to speak quietly with David, the senior flight attendant. "Did you notice how tense Nancy's been?" she asked, keeping her voice low. "It's like she's walking on eggshells." David nodded, his expression serious. "Yeah, I noticed. And it's not just her. The whole cabin feels off. Passengers are picking up on it too." Rachel hesitated, then added, "That guy in first class. James, I think his name is. He seems to be watching everything. Do you think he's someone important?" David glanced toward first class, where James sat with an air of quiet authority. "He's definitely not just another passenger," David said. "I've seen that look before. He's someone who gets things done." Rachel frowned, unsure what to make of it. She had always enjoyed her job, the way it allowed her to meet people from all walks of life. But today felt different, heavier somehow. She wondered if this flight would be one of those stories that stuck with her long after it was over. In the cabin, the tension continued to ripple through the passengers. A man in his 50s, seated across the aisle from Sophia, leaned over slightly and spoke to her in a low voice. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened earlier. That wasn't right." Sophia looked at him, startled by his kindness. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice tinged with both gratitude and exhaustion. She didn't elaborate, and the man didn't press her, simply nodding and sitting back in his seat. James caught the interaction from his vantage point in first class. He made a mental note of the passenger's gesture, filing it away as another reminder of the impact moments like these could have on people. It wasn't just about policies and procedures. It was about humanity, about the way people treated one another when they thought no one was watching. As the plane continued its journey, the unspoken tension between Nancy and the rest of the cabin grew more pronounced. Nancy avoided eye contact with her colleagues and the passengers, her focus narrowing to the tasks in front of her. But she couldn't escape the feeling that she was being watched, not just by James but by everyone. And deep down, she knew this wasn't just about a single interaction. This was about who she was and how she chose to carry herself in moments of stress. Sophia leaned back in her seat, her hand resting gently on Daniel's shoulder as he played. She tried to focus on the promise of their destination, the vacation she had worked so hard to plan. But the memory of Nancy's harsh words lingered, a reminder that even the smallest moments could leave lasting marks. Sophia glanced toward the front of the plane, where James sat with an air of quiet authority. She didn't know who he was, but she sensed that he wasn't just another passenger. The atmosphere in the cabin felt like a coiled spring, each minute adding to the tension that had yet to find its release. Passengers exchanged quiet glances, their curiosity growing with every passing moment. Nancy, still moving through her duties with forced precision, felt the walls closing in around her, and James, his sharp eyes taking in every detail, knew that the resolution to this situation would define more than just this flight. It would define what the airline stood for.